I'm most interested at the moment is the extent to which compassion could mediate positive outcomes with psychedelics, and whether helping people to access compassion could be a beneficial thing to do in psychedelic psychotherapy. I did a research fellowship at Hopkins, and like the Hopkins protocol is like you blast the person to the moon with a heroic dose, and it's more like a self-directed thing. And just from that like high arousal, relaxed self state, and then accessing the mystic experience, that seems to be sufficient for creating like life change in a lot of people. And people report this as being something, the top 5 most meaningful things that ever happened to them. And for a lot of people, it changes their life around. One of the things I'm wondering, though, is whether is something like self-compassion and compassion for others as being like one of the things you particularly want to change to have like a better life.
Adam Safron is a cognitive neuroscientist weaving together psychedelics, consciousness, and AI research. Previously at Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelics and Consciousness, he now works with Michael Levin at Tufts. He's the architect of the integrated world modeling theory, attempting to unify different theories of consciousness, while in his spare time he's modeled orgasms as rhythmic brain entrainment. To say he's a well-rounded scientist is an understatement. I want to warn you that this is the most technical conversation I've ever had on what psychedelics do in the brain and how they transform our consciousness. But what I was left with was a far deeper understanding of what's really going on, and this is what you will get if you listen through to the end. Subscribe if you want your world model upgraded without a heroic dose. Side effects may include benevolent machine elves reorganizing your to-do list.
A lot of people report actually that the DMT world feels more real than the real world. And for people who like don't have like stable ontologies, it'll actually sometimes cause them to actually change their belief about the nature of the world. And some people will say like, there's this other dimension that's more real. There seems to be like a symmetrification of your experience. Circles seem more circular. It's like what's commonly reported when people go to this other world is they'll encounter entities. Terence McKenna called them machine elves. They're oftentimes reported as being mischievous, the machine elves. But for some people, they might be fun tricksters. For some people, they might be less fun tricksters.
Do we know what specifically that is? What DMT is doing differently? Do we know why it doesn't happen as much with other psychedelic substances? Is there a neural correlate of DMT mechanical mischievous agents? Is there like a neural signature of that? Adam Safron, what is the best way to think about the free energy principle in simple terms? This is a hard concept that I've been grappling with on the podcast. How should we think about this?
Hard question, but I would say the free energy principle could be understood as both a general systems theory in terms of it's a good way of understanding what it means to be a system and what systems do. And then you can take a diverse range of systems and evaluate them using a common evaluatory scheme or language. So a common way of understanding whether you're talking about like a brain or some of its origins, not origins, but it connects ideas like the Bayesian brain, or like the idea of brains as inference engines are trying to figure out the world and model the world in themselves, or even like a cell. Think of a cell as a kind of like intelligent modeling system, a brain by other means, or maybe an ant colony, or an economy, or Gaia, or like how can you think of different systems in their systemness and in their intelligence? And in terms of intelligence, the idea being the ability to, model the world and navigate the world to achieve goals. So the free energy principle in some ways starts from the idea that that there are any systems at all is somewhat surprising. And that, like, given a world governed by like the second law and entropy, where things become most maximally probable as they get all mixed up, how do things manage to continue to thing in the way that they thing? Like, why don't you just get
Right.
all, why does it just get like kind of like, all messed up in the meat grinder of existence? So the idea is that some sort of intelligence, some sort of ability is needed to allow systems to continue in their way. And part of this is their ability to entail in some way information to be able to model and predict the dynamics that they encounter within themselves and within the world, and then to adjust themselves so that they can keep thinking. So that's like, and yeah, that's my best attempt at encapsulating the free energy principle.
That's good, man. I think that's really interesting. So is the free energy principle, you said the economy there, is it just for living biological systems? Can I use the free energy principle to describe my computer, to describe my camera? Is it useful in non-biological systems?
It is. So the attempt is like, to the degree that you have a thing at all. So to the degree that there's any kind of attracting state that you can identify for any length of period of time, you then can come up with an account of this system as what sometimes I think Jacob Howie introduced this term of as self-evidencing, where it's whenever it's there's like an older philosophical notion of, I guess, like conatus, like there's like a kind of willingness in anything that exists. But the idea is like, to the degree that you can point to something and separate it as saying this is its own thing separate from its environment, draw a boundary around it, sometimes called a Markov blanket, then you can apply the free energy principle and saying, okay, somehow it's doing something. It might not be very intelligent, but it's doing something on some length of time to preserve its Markov blanket or its boundary, its probabilistic, the borders of what defines its existence. And that's what the blanket means. So the borders of the system.
Right.
So apply it to a computer, apply it to a rock. They would be less interesting kinds of free energy, or they'd be less interesting kinds of free energy minimizing or surprisal minimizing. Okay, so the systems that continue the system they vary in how the range of their the sophistication of their adaptiveness, what they can bring to bear in this process of reacting to things, and also not just reacting, but potentially planning with depth into the future, and then proactively taking actions based on what it anticipates deeper into the future, and then proactively adjusting things. So a rock does not have a deep temporal model into the future whereby it's adjusting its actions. It's just immediately reacting to whatever it's happening to it from moment to moment, and then decaying over time slowly. But the rock is just, its prediction is it holds itself together through its intermolecular forces. It's good at that, but it's very unintelligent. But still, you could say that is a very peculiar, but that's a kind of free energy minimizing system, and that it is a thing. I think you could apply it to anything, with thing being in scare quotes. There are other formalisms that are a little bit different. So there's some work in it which is focusing not so much on the attracting state, sometimes called a non-equilibrium steady state distribution. So there's non-equilibrium that's in flux, but it's a steady state, and that there's something steady or solid you could point to within flux, a stability. And so that's like this Markov blanket is saying, okay, here's like the steady thing, here's its boundaries. But there are other ways of thinking about it that are under development. My friend Dalton works on this a good amount of based on trajectories and paths through space also. So to try to answer your question, I would say, the free energy principle is extremely ambitious in its scope, and that it tries to be a theory of everything, and with the thing in scare quotes. And to the degree it is doing its thingness, it's understood as minimizing its free energy. And so what does that mean, minimizing your free energy? So it's coming back to this idea of like, for something to continue at all, it has to be doing something kind of clever, something kind of like, I guess there's this thought experiment like Maxwell's demon, but it has to be doing something like in order to avoid becoming maximum improbable, to the degree you pull this off, you have to be doing something clever. Then one derivation of you can think of the free energy principle is from cybernetics, this idea of the good regulator theorem from like Conan and Ashby, the idea of like to govern a system, you have to also be a model of the system. So it's like to control something, you have to have some sort of modeling relation. And so then free energies can be thought of as formally as a kind of a predictive modeling entailed in the characteristics of a system, where the system is what's being governed is its ability to hold itself together as continuous conditions as the kind of system it is, and then you're evaluating the effectiveness of this based on where does the system get it wrong relative to the prediction of its continuity. So so then this is called surprisal, where like and so yeah, so the free energy principle as a theory of everything is saying that uh, all systems that can be identified in some ways must entail a kind of modeling relation or mutual information with respect to their environment, and then evaluating systems based on their ability to continue to succeed with respect to this implicit, sometimes explicit goal, but this implicit goal of being able to persist.
Right.
So it's a theory of everything.
Well, it's a ridiculously hard thing to explain in simple language. So I know that's a hard question to kick off on, but I think it's going to set the tone for the rest of the conversation. But what I'm getting from that and the essence of it is that a generative model, some aspect of a model, is absolutely crucial to this idea. And in humans, what's correcting against that generative model that we have is our perception, right? So we have a model of vision, we have a model of what something might look like, and then what our visual perception is doing is basically correcting that model. And when, tell me if any of this is wrong, when you have a big enough difference between what our generative model says and what our vision says, that seems to be sort of crucial to where consciousness kicks in. There's there's an error correction. There's a prediction error that's happened there. And that's kind of when our consciousness kicks in. You know, you go to turn the doorknob and you expect it to be open, but then it's closed. Oh, my prediction had an error. I physically corrected for it. And then consciousness kicks in. Oh, why is that closed? Do you think that's, of course, it's far more complicated than that, but do you think that gets at the core of it, at least when it pertains to being a human?
I'd say that's a great description, and that was actually my first interest in it, is as like a theory of neural functioning. This idea of like the Bayesian brain, or the brain as a kind of like predictive model that's updating itself whenever it gets things wrong, but is constantly trying to predict its inputs, and then via this idea of a generative model, it's trying to infer what is likely to be the case given the rest of the observations, and then this model by which the inference happens, you then update it wherever you get it wrong. And so, and I think the connection to consciousness is also that's an important issue to dig into, of like where consciousness can come into it. And I think in terms of consciousness, and I guess the sense of like self-consciousness, kind of like the account that Heidegger would provide of like you're kind of in the world in this state of sort of like effortless mastery, and things are ready to hand, and so you're just like, but it's only like when you get it wrong and you slip, and then like you get your finger with the hammer when you're hammering, then things become present to hand, and then you're now aware of them, and they're kind of what was before this like in the background is now in the foreground, and you're aware of it. And so like the idea of like prediction error being the thing that brings online consciousness in terms of like our self-reflective abilities, I'd say the way you describe that is like exactly right. And actually your previous conversation about flow, I don't know if that would exactly be the hard problem, but this idea of like, normally you're basically trying to handle things in the most efficient way, taking care of your predictions, minimizing your prediction error as close to like the business end of the interaction with the environment as possible. Sometimes even outsourcing them outside of your body, like in the work of like Andy Clark and the extended mind, or like Clark and Chalmers, where like the modeling even takes the form of like the way you construct the niche around you and your environment to actually minimize prediction error by being in a hopefully well-controlled environment. But otherwise, like you can think of like minds and brains as these hierarchies or hierarchies of predictions. And so and so you're trying to, as low down in the hierarchy, even outside of you, in terms of the bounds of what you normally consider to be, you try to resolve it. And so if you are predicting things well, if you're in the state of mastery where your model is well equipped to handle what it's encountering, you might be able to handle things via kind of like loose, flexibly assembled reflex arcs, which would be controlled by like, the cerebellar system would be like and closer to like primary motor cortex, and then and different combinations of just reflexes just happening. You're just getting it done. Like kind of like, the way we speak, for instance, like I don't know what these muscles are doing. They're just doing their thing. Like if I had to do what for walking, it wouldn't work. And so, but when you can't resolve it, then like the things that are normally unconscious in the background, then all of a sudden you become aware of it wherever you got it wrong, and the prediction error was unable to be resolved, and you're unable to account for the thing surprised you. And then the information will propagate deeper in, and you'll be more likely to become aware of it. Now, in terms of it could be, it gets fuzzy, but it could be important like to try to distinguish between different notions of consciousness in terms of something like creature consciousness or phenomenal consciousness, in terms of like what it feels like to be a system, or like what some people might call qualia, in terms of like the textures and qualities of your sensorium, or your awareness of your experience. So like your conscious access. And so the Heideggerian account definitely applies to like the idea of like self-consciousness and conscious access. But there's when we're talking about like the hard problem in terms of why is it that there is anything that feels like to be any kind of system? Like what is it that generates experiences or sensoriums? Why should there be an experienceable sensorium? It's that. So I'd say like a Neil Seth would probably agree. You spoke to him before, and the work that I do, that's the entailment of the prediction of the generative model. And then your sense data is updating the predictions, but the actual like quail generator, the actual like the filling in of probable sensorium states given past experience in your current sense data, and filling in this more complete sensorium, and I guess this school of thinking, it would be the prediction is the thing entailing the consciousness itself. But then the prediction error would be, but where you're getting the most prediction errors happening, that's going to be the thing that's going to be most in the foreground of what you predict next, and that's going to be in the foreground of your consciousness, and then that'll. But yeah, so I don't. Yes.
No, it's well. I think it's well explained. So I've been trying to drink less alcohol. And honestly, it's had a pretty big impact on my health. I'm sleeping better, I'm exercising more, and my business is growing. The data suggests that people are drinking less alcohol than ever, which overall I think is great, but I'm still looking for a little treat at the end of the workday or a hard workout. And that's where Sentia comes in. Sentia is a 0% alcohol drink that feels like you're drinking something special without any of the downsides. It's created by neuroscientists, and it's designed to give you that relaxing buzz. The same kind of feeling you get from alcohol, but without the hangover, brain fog, or impact on sleep quality. And it tastes absolutely delicious. They already have a GABA red berry, which is perfect to mix with a tonic or orange, or GABA black, which is awesome with Coke. Personally, I've been really enjoying the GABA gold with Fanta lemon on ice.
That's actually genuinely delicious. Like, I'm not even play acting there. It's actually just really, really good.
So you might be wondering, how does a drink with 0% alcohol give you that buzz? It almost sounds too good to be true. Well, this is the really cool neuroscience part. The secret is GABA, the brain's natural calming agent. And the different GABA flavors have different cognitive effects. Sentia's founder, Dr. David Nutt, has published over 500 independent research papers and written 34 books on neuropharmacology. What Dr. Nutt realized was that we can harness the same calming, relaxing effects from alcohol without any of the side effects. I genuinely think this could be the future of drinking. And they're also just releasing their first beer and stout, which as an Irishman I am dying to compare to Guinness. Sentia are offering my viewers 10% off their first purchase, and I genuinely could not recommend it more. I think even if you're looking to just substitute your one gin and tonic on a Tuesday with Sentia, the cumulative health benefits over time will actually be very noticeable. So check out Sentia, again 10% off at checkout.
There's an aspect to this that's possibly a stupid question, but I've never really understood. If we are organisms wired to reduce surprise, to minimize prediction error, then why do we do so many things that are novelty seeking? Why do we climb mountains? Why do we jump off cliffs? Why do we do all this crazy behavior that's obviously not minimizing surprise? If I was trying to minimize surprise, I would lock myself in a black room or something, right? Like clearly human beings aren't wired to do that, which means on an organismal level, we're not really wired to minimize surprise. So where does that difference come in? I'm kind of curious to tease that apart.
Yeah, so the dark room problem, and
I didn't know that had a name. I just used dark room as an example.
It's
people have thought of this before me.
It has a name. It's notorious and celebrated and infamous in among the Fristonians, in terms of it was a thing that was like vexing them for a while, in terms of providing different accounts that would satisfy people about whether that problem was handled. And I've heard there's one idea would be this idea of active inference, which is kind of like an entailment of the free energy principle, and it's the idea of systems and organismic systems in particular, the way by which they minimize their free energy, or the way by which they continue to thing, is what they're predicting is themselves in the future pursuing policies of action or patterns of action that are likely to help them to continue to persist. And so you get to this idea of like deep temporal models, where you're trying to predict yourself following sequences of actions extended over time in the future that are adaptive, hopefully. And so so some of these things would come from like learning in terms of what's adaptive in terms of what would let you like avoid like certain pleasures, and or rather avoid certain pains and approach certain pleasures, in terms of like you want to avoid damage to your body, but also like homeostasis, for instance. Like, so like you'll have like these regulatory nuclei of like the hypothalamus, for instance, and they can be thought of as like predicting like where you ought to be as an organism to keep staying alive, by keeping like these ranges of values for your essential variables for your internal milieu. Like, so the different aspects of your metabolism, your respiration, your heart rate, your temperature, if you go far beyond these, you die. And so you can think of like there's certain kind of evolutionary priors or predictions kind of built in there at the level of like your inner lamprey. They're saying that you have to resolve prediction error with respect to. So if you just like stayed in a dark room, pretty soon you would get hungry or you would get cold. And so this, so it would play out there. That'd be one level of learning. But then you also learn like explicit models of what you from experience of or both implicit and explicit models of like what you think is likely to help you get along in the world and be okay, and minimize your surprise with respect to the prediction that I will be okay. And so and these can take variety of forms. So it's not just like I don't want to stay in the box because I'll get like cold and hungry and die. It's not just like my hypothalamus, but it's also like the story of my life. Like you're predicting yourself among others in hopefully harmonious relations that are meaningful, and and so like it's gonna be hard to do that if you're just in the box. And so,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
with stuff like a flourishing life, you'll also get sources of prediction error. But yeah, at the base level, though, there's a sense where uh, it is like somewhat puzzling. Like the best way, minimizing the complexity of your environment is like why don't you just do that? And I think we oftentimes do that. And I think you can think of things like addiction, or of various forms, or just like the way we might seek comfort to the point of restrict, removing like the richness from our life, or making things too predictable. I think we actually don't completely resolve the dark room problem in
Right.
terms of we put ourselves oftentimes in dimly lit rooms as a way of trying to minimize our surprisal, and we actually sometimes do maladaptively, in terms of what would result in the most overall flourishing and fitness. We sometimes do take shortcuts to minimizing prediction error.
Very interesting. Yeah, I thought that was well explained. Give us an example maybe of generative models that I have in my brain, you have in your brain, any of the listeners have. Do we have thousands, millions? Like, just give a few examples of generative models.
So I guess the basic idea of a generative model is, you can think of, I guess, in contrast to a discriminative model, in terms of something within deep learning. This wouldn't be necessarily in the brain, but parts of the brain could be understood with devils and details in those terms. In terms of you look at the systems that can generate deep fakes. There is a variety of these that took different forms. Now we use transformers, but there are other networks we would use before that are not too different in terms of their fundamental principles. But you can, in a discriminative model, you can say, okay, so given a set of data of inputs, you can train a network to say, okay, to classify things like, okay, I think now this is like a dog or a cat, or this is like a face or a house, or something. You can train a network to distinguish among different types of stimuli. But then once you've trained it up, you can run it in reverse, and you can say, using the patterns of connections, you can say, okay, given what I, given now me predicting house, my experience of past houses, I'm now going to generate houses or faces. And so deep fakes, for instance, are generative models that are producing likely images of stimuli, including people, given past data. And so there's a sense in which I've been meaning to write a popular piece, I am a strange loop deepfake, in terms of I don't want to trivialize the hard problem, but there is a sense between the entailment of a generative model that can produce deep fakes. Your experience can be thought of rough in those terms, but instead of generating a pixel array, you're generating all of your different modalities in different combinations from moment to moment, whether it's continuous stream or snapshots. There's more devils and details, but the idea is all of the particular qualities of what it's like to be you in any given moment, inferring those, filling in more complete sensoriums given past data, and this ability to infer likely data. That's what makes it a generative model. You can generate likely data given past experience. That this is something what we're looking as the entailment relationship between brain and mind, or biophysics and experience. That's the entailment of a generative model and the data that it can produce. And that if you look at that dynamic and you interpret it abstractly, you can understand these as entailing algorithms unfolding. And the algorithms are specifically those of the inversion of a generative model over your sensorium, filling in likely sensorium states. But the idea of a generative model, though, is broader when it comes to the free energy principle, and that it basically treats anything that can thing, any system, it says that is a generative process and model. And so it's you would treat, for taking the rock, you'd say, okay, I'm going to now talk about the rock as a generative model. It's a not particularly interesting kind of generative model in terms of what it can produce. But the idea is systems are understood as generative models, and that they are generating through their action themselves. so but you could also have I always have mixed feelings about the theory of everything aspect of the free energy principle, because that is part of what interested me in it to begin with. Specifically there's some connections between like the free energy principle and the idea of like universal Darwinism, where like you can think of like any system that exists as a kind of like evolutionary system, and like these like theories of everything, I find them very interesting in that like to be able to take insights from one domain and then like apply it to another, like to understand like the mind is a kind of evolutionary system, or to understand like the economy is a kind of brain, or the brain is a kind of economy. Like I think there's like interesting insights to be gained, but it does get weird though when you start trying to talk about everything. So anyways, so to come back to the brain as generative models, you can say like any system within the brain, whether you're talking about like a cortical column, that would be like a little generative model there, but then we put them together, it's a broader generative model. So it's like, and then at different times evolving, there's a modularity about it also, where it's like the brain, depending on like the granularity at which you're thinking about it, you can either like zoom in locally and say, okay, here's like a little bit functioning as a generative model, trying to infer its input. Like here's like a cortical column trying to like predict its inputs, and there's like a little local generative model. Or there's like there's the, or different like specialized subsystems. Like here's the hippocampus acting as a generative model, or the brain, as a broader set of neural systems working together to collectively predict their inputs. Because it's always like, you go down to the, are you talking about the cortical microcolumn of like, roughly like 100 neurons, or like something like macro columns, or like thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of neurons, if you're talking about like a whisker barrel, or like predict like what a whisker is going to do. Or are you talking about trying to predict your entire sensorium and like the whole like, whole back of the brain all put together, like maybe bound, like maybe communicating like alpha frequencies? That's another kind of generative model. And then there's like some of these generative models, well, all of them are in the same game of trying to most elegantly model the world, and elegantly and accurately model the world. They have different properties when they're brought together in different combinations of different local generative models into broader ones, and some of these might entail your conscious experience,
Right?
but not all of them.
Not all of them. I was just going to ask: is a way that we could think about consciousness as the model of all of your other models integrated into one model? Is that consciousness?
In the flow conversation, he might have mentioned like Butsaki, but this idea of like rhythms and oscillations being a kind of syntax by which the brain information flows through it, and that like neurons have to coordinate in their activity in order for their signals to like sum rather than decay. And this idea from, I think, Pascal Fries, called like communication through coherence, right? Neurons, when they can become synced in time, then their signals can you can get mutual information, the signals can sum, but if they're but this requires something like a kind of resonance or synchronization process to happen. But so in terms of the biophysics that would entail experience, like there's a certain time scale over which the mutual information can come together, where neurons can sync up. And so so let's say, for instance, for the sake of argument, that your sensorium right now, let's say the belief about what's in the world is a joint prediction across your modalities, and the frequency at which this is happening, let's say it's at alpha, something like 8 to 12 times a second. With a side idea of being, so there's a general idea of, this is actually the work of Butsaki and others also, but like a general heuristic of like, there's an inverse relationship between the speed of a neural rhythm and the number of neurons that participate in it. So let's say like you're talking about something like gamma or like high gamma, like going, 100, 120 times a second or something like that. Maybe that's like a local, like a microcolumn. You can come to agreement in this little area really quickly. But let's say you want to get neurons to form like a resonance structure and sync up and oscillate together over a broader swath. So let's say it's something like you want to get the entire back of your brain all talking to another. It probably can't do that at that high speed to get the agreement. So it tends to be like a slower oscillation that brings more distributed neuronal populations into the mix to come to a temporary communication network.
Right.
And so, so the idea, I guess, would be like the timescales over which you get this synchronous coherence that would allow your modalities to talk to one another, there might still be some things that are in and some things that are out. And so this is you know, an ongoing discussion that I've been having with like Mark Solms and others of like what is on the inside versus the outside. And so I've been wondering that, you know, I don't want to like reduce like the brainstem in terms of just being like the plug in the wall, like he described. I think he's right.
Yeah.
That's like that's underselling what's happening there. But the idea being that like when let's say that like the entire back of my brain is coming into like sync, or is coming is generating like these votes are all being like rallied of like what's the current prediction of what's happening, that there might be an in and an out. And so the entire brain or body wouldn't necessarily be in it. And how restricted, it's not clear. Like, is it like, for instance, like, is it the scope of like what's ever in the synchronization manifold of alpha? Or is it maybe some like even like some subnetwork clocking even more quickly at like beta? Like it could be like you know, it could be even more. I don't know if I'd say like what's in versus what's out in terms of a physical and computational substrate of consciousness, and what's generating the estimates of system and world. I'd say it's probably not all of the brain, just in the same way like the body's on the outside, but it's a subnetwork that can come to agreement on a given a sufficiently rapid time scale that it can estimate what's happening such that you can both inform and be informed by action perception cycles as they unfold. And so I view this as like actually the primary adaptive value of phenomenal consciousness is actually giving you a kind of data structure, which is basically giving you data fusion across your modalities, where you're prioritizing things based on their relative importance, where some things are more likely to be attended to or given more processing power than others. But basically, my system world relation estimated from moment to moment, where this inversion of a generative model over my sensorium and generating, in this case, likely sensorium states as a stream of experience. This is how I view phenomenal consciousness. And I don't think just the way like, you know, could like, I don't think all of the brain gets into the mix at the time scale over which those predictions are generated, even though they're all ultimately informing. Yeah.
That was a head scratcher. I hope the listeners were able to follow that. I think I faded. I think I lost you at a bit, but then I got back.
Well, this might be more helpful. So okay, so like the brainstem, so if the stream of consciousness is specifically sensorium states, if it's like you know, what I'm seeing, you know, what I'm hearing, what I'm feeling, if there's like the appearance of the world to a body at its center, if that's the thing you're trying to explain, it's not in order to pull that off, you wouldn't necessarily need every bit of the brain to be synced up when that's happening. And so, so there might be some parts that are, you would ultimately want all of them for adaptive behavior. You'd want all the brain to be able to talk to one another. And for instance, the brainstem portions that Mark emphasizes that are monitoring your homeostasis and how well you're doing as an organism and the basics of life management, you would want that to have influence. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily directly part of the processes that generate your stream of experience. It might be influencing them, but not necessarily. It might be still, though, on the outside, the timescales over which you're getting the different parts of the brain communicating with each other to create this joint inference of what is the system world relation in a holistic way. But even though it's holistic, not everything might not be in there participating in the generation of this holistic estimate.
Right.
I don't know if
I think that made sense. I think that made sense. I think I understood. What I'm interested in is if all of my different parts of my brain are running their own generative models, and the point of their own generative models is to make predictions about how they can persist optimally through time, how do they know to sync up with each other to form one larger generative model? Why are the neuron generative models in my thalamus, why are necessarily the actions for them to persist through time aligned with the neurons and generative models of my prefrontal cortex or my kidney or my heart? How do they bind themselves into one unified organism with one goal? Do they not have very different goals based on their own positionings, based on their own environment, based on their own internal milieu, all the other factors, but they're all glued together cohesively into one? Like, we're just billions of cells all glued together into one. Like, how do they know to what's the binding glue?
You could potentially have I guess a few different whys unfolding on different time scales. So you can have like an evolutionary prediction or prior in terms of like the way the overall properties of the connectomics of the brain are specified by genetics, for instance. So it's like you can have just letting the developmental program unfold. Certain parts of the brain will be more connected than others, and the more connectivity you have between different areas, the greater their ability will be to exchange mutual information and sync up and form different attracting states, or collaborate in forming different attracting states where their activity can be in sync and mutually informing. I sometimes think of this as like filling in like a crossword puzzle. In real time, it's like each part is filling in all the rest based on past experience. But you can also get, for instance, like a history of developmental learning in terms of what was mutually informing, in terms of something where we're talking about Hebbian association, just like what went together in the past, or some like other plasticity rules like spike timing dependent plasticity in terms of like what went together, but where like the order of the firings was in a certain relation, where the sequences of activity were came online right, but don't worry about that. But the idea is like through plasticity rules, then the brain can figure, okay, now here's who should talk to whom. Based on, here's who was able to predict whom in the past or inform each other in the past. And then this would be another way in which you can get neurons connected to one another such that they can, at any given moment, sync up. And there might also be, just from moment to moment, there's like part of, I guess, the idea of free energy minimization in terms of like physics or like resonance is like physical systems in general, when they resonate with one another, they find whatever way it is that lets them minimize their activity. And so just the real-time dynamics as they unfold, also the brain can like find whatever works in terms of whoever, by whatever means, can talk to one another. And then in any given moment, just like the evolving attractor dynamics as the activity propagates, you'll be trying out these different combinations of systems talking to one another. How do different parts of the brain come to be able to talk to one another that they can form these attracting states? I'd say it would be, there's a story that would play out on the level of evolution and development in terms of like the unfolding of like developmental programs of like connecting the brain, the learning over the course of the experience of the organism in terms of what it encountered in the world, and there's what went together, and then just in the moment of like whatever works that achieves coherence by any means. But then and these would be different means by which the brain, by which nervous systems can come into sync. And with the idea being that the synchrony is part of the binding in terms of it's what allows there to be mutual information. I'd say there's like more devils and details in terms of like the way the information goes together in particular. So like you've been having some really interesting conversations on, for instance, like synesthesia. Like there's there's statistics of the way like the modalities go together, and so sometimes you can have binding that's of like non-traditional kinds in terms of, and then you get like synesthetic phenomenology.
Yes. Yes.
And then you were discussing like, are there some things like experiences like with different like kinds of blocks or different like things in the world that made it so that you ended up getting that unusual binding profile relative to normies? And so
How something I know that you work in Michael Levin's lab. One of the concepts that he really taught me about and I learned through his work was bioelectricity. I think I was curious in seeing how the concept of bioelectricity plays into this role of getting all of these billions of different components that have their own generative models trying to persist through time. Like what role bioelectricity plays in unifying all of those selves into a whole.
I don't think we know.
Okay.
And so the general phenomenon, I guess, that would playing out at the level of the nervous system would be, I guess, maybe sometimes called ephaptic coupling, but the idea of like when the electrical field, so the neurons are communicating with one another electrochemically in terms of like, as they spike, they'll then release like the neurotransmitters, they'll go across the cleft, and then they're signalizing like unit to unit. But as they're like the ions are flowing in and out of them, and especially if like the neurons are kind of already in sync as like the ions are flowing out of them, you'll also get these like electromagnetic fields around them. And then these electromagnetic fields created by the ions flowing in and out of multiple neurons can then themselves influence how the ions flow and influence like the degree to which like a neuron can get like excited or fire. So there's a sense in which like as neurons can start to come into sync, they'll give rise to an evoked collective electromagnetic field. And then this can basically boost neurons to further come into sync that are getting active at the right time in terms of like, there's like I guess Carl would call it like circular causation, I guess it's like, or spiral causation, but it's like the neurons start to sync, you get an evoked electromagnetic field, and this helps with further sync. And obviously you'd want some limit on this, otherwise you'd get epilepsy. You don't want just like everything to sync, like, but still.
Yeah.
So I guess the question I would have with respect to something like phenomenal binding is, even though like ephaptic coupling is clearly important, like for instance, like it might be part of how like you get like synchronization of let's say like a cortical microcolumn or something like this. Like it seems that the phenomenon locally it's more difficult to imagine larger scale neuronal dynamics being constrained by electromagnetic fields than it is for like a local area, like because you're getting so much heterogeneity, and so of like where and there's also some reasons to like it seems like we might be like we're sensitive to electromagnetic fields in terms of like you can do things like transcranial electrical stimulation or TMS, and you can't like intervene in brain activity, but it's like it doesn't seem that the electrical field at the level as a brain as a whole is contributing to phenomenal binding. But some ideas that I've been wondering about is whether there are actually subnetworks of the brain where, like particularly like in like hub structures, where you might have like local signaling. This one might be hard to explain, but there might be some subnetworks of the brain where if you zoomed in on them, the evoked electromagnetic field is actually an important part of the neural dynamics forming, like the way that they coherently form, and that you are getting an electromagnetic binding effect. I'm just skeptical that it's happening brain-wide.
Right. So, I was under the impression that it wasn't just happening brain-wide, but it was kind of happening organism-wide. And the only reason that heart cells all collaborate together to form a heart, and the only reason all of the cells in my legs, hands, eyes, any bit knows knows, in inverted commas, to link up into a whole was some sort of bioelectricity acting as the cognitive glue, as I think Dr. Michael Levin would state it. But is what you're saying there maybe saying that that's not necessarily the case, that binding might be happening on a local level, but it's likely not happening on a global organism or organ level?
So you're definitely getting a kind of binding in terms of you are getting forms of synchronization organism wide, like for instance, like he clearly establishes that with um like the flatworms, in terms of you'll see the where the for the electromagnetic faces, for instance, or like where the head ends up going. This seems to be like almost like a wave guide for morphogenesis, right? The cells like fill in. That's like how they know where to stop, and the overall like shape of the phenotype is actually specified by like an electromagnetic field. And where the electromagnetic field also has this kind of like circular causal story where it's like it both emerges from all the local units but also constrains them, which then uh, what the local units do is based on what they're overall doing, and then what they're overall doing is then feeds back on what the local unit's doing in a kind of circular causal process. And through this, you end up getting coherent morphotypes or harmonics forming in terms of specific shapes or another. And so you definitely do get like uh, mutual information and binding, and you can even think of these things as like neural networks by other means, as they're like patterns of like mutually informative signaling. Um, uh, the thing that I'm wondering about, whether the processes that give rise to phenomenal consciousness involve body-wide fields or even brain-wide fields, but might actually be subnetworks, and where those subnetworks may or may not heavily depend on electromagnetic fields for their synchronization to occur, and determining what is like in or out of any given moment of experience in terms of what gets bound to what. It could be actually crucially important. The electromagnetic fields are there, that are part of the story, but we don't know whether they are. And it seems like it's probably not a brain-wide thing or body-wide thing in terms of what's
Interesting.
in or out of any given moment of experience. Even
Right.
though that is crucially important for coherent biological functioning.
Yes. Interesting. I had John Joe McFadden on the podcast. I'm not sure if you got the time to watch that episode or are familiar with his work, but he is very heavy on the line that consciousness is an electromagnetic field. He thinks that it's not in the brain; it is a property of the electromagnetic field itself. He thinks that somewhat solves the binding problem, this integrating problem of how we're a unified self. That it's not, the consciousness isn't found in the physical matter but of the brain, but the field itself. What would you say to that idea?
Could be. It's but then the question I'm wondering is which field is it? So
Yeah.
is it a brain um yeah, is it a brain-wide field, or the field within some subnetwork of the brain, or and some would say even like a body-wide field. I tend to lean towards probably some subnetwork, but
Right.
I can see why though people would look towards like um, this electromagnetic field in terms of like its holistic properties as being part of binding.
Yes.
And but I just don't think we know.
Right. I'm curious to dive into your work on psychedelics. I know you've done a lot of work here. I think it's a fascinating field. It's something that I've been able to talk to a lot of experts on. How does psychedelics play into this active inference, free energy principle? These ideas that we've been building throughout this conversation. What effect do psychedelics have on the brain's free energy principle?
Mm. I think there might be there are both common principles for thinking of like the free energy principle and active inference. There are common stories to be told across psychedelic phenomena, but there are also distinct ones. So, for instance, like so psychedelics at least the classic psychedelics, they'll act on this subclass of serotonin receptors called the 5-HT2A receptors. They tend to be concentrated both on these layer 5 or deep pyramidal neurons that will loop with the thalamus. They can shoot for distance and loop for the thalamus, and the thalamus can help to sync them up. This is part of how you can think of like the predictions as basically large zones of synchrony where neurons mutually inform one another, and then as they come to mutual coherent activity, they then this would be the source of this descending stream of predictions where you're trying to minimize your prediction error or predict your inputs, and then you update it based on where you got it wrong. And so like this, so the slower rhythms and this idea of predictive coding within the free energy principle, or you're updating your generative model based on what you get wrong, you're based on the prediction errors that these L5 pyramidal neurons, where the psychedelics are, where psychedelics tend to act. In this account of REBUS and the anarchic brain, or relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, that Robin Carhart-Harris and Carl Friston put forward, the idea is that these neurons will get so excited by the 5-HT2A receptor stimulation that they don't wait for each other to come into sync. And so they start firing out of sync. You get a kind of paradoxical excitation-induced desynchronization.
Right.
And I'd say this is somewhat paradoxical, and that way you can see it being the case. Like if you just like turn up the heat too much, the thing becomes chaotic and things go out of sync. It's not necessarily the case that if you increase the gain on the units that shoot for distance and sync up, that they'll sync more poorly. So what I've been suggesting and the work I've been doing is that I say the canonical count that's most recognized is that psychedelics relax your predictions or flatten your free energy landscape in terms of you let go of some of your priors and what you're expecting. And so this makes moments of experience more novel. You're more likely to be surprised by what's in the world, more sensitive to what's in the environment. And so like a lot of the phenomenology of psychedelics are well accounted for, I'd say, in terms of this idea of like relaxing your priors. And so what I've been saying is like, yes, however, I'm wondering if you're both getting strengthened beliefs and relaxed beliefs, and that this sometimes both indirectly and directly. And so like the reason I was thinking in these terms partially is one account of hallucinations from psychedelics, or like psychotomimetic cognition or delusions, is you can think of those as actually excessively strong priors or predictions. So it's like you're not letting what you're expecting be contradicted by the sense data. And so I think that's in some ways potentially a little bit more straightforward, that like if you excite the units that sync up, that you might help them to sync up better, and they might sync up even too strong, and that overly strong sync might result in non-veridical perception or cognition that might be have certain psychotic qualities in terms of like it has too much of a momentum, it's too compelling. I don't want to pathologize it necessarily, but like that can also be a source of like insight and meaning in therapy. But it can also not. I guess one more. I don't want to go into too many weeds, but so the 5-HT2A neurons, they're also found in like layers 2, 3, where the prediction errors come in, and they're found specifically in the inhibitory interneurons there. And so I think you can also think of psychedelics as what they're doing as shielding you, even though it seems like you're seeing the environment more vividly, you might actually be seeing your expectation more. And so one way of thinking of them is like being closer to like a waking dream. And so there's some other accounts of like hallucinations where things like Charles Bonnet syndrome, where like if you start to go blind within a modality, you start to hallucinate within that modality. Or sometimes people will have like hallucinatory experiences in like sensory deprivation tanks. And so, I'd say the standard account for the free energy principle is that psychedelics relax your beliefs, and so allow you to experience things in novel combinations. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but what I've been saying is it's likely to be some combination of strengthened and relaxed beliefs at different parts of this hierarchy of all these different generative models. and where you're going to get all sorts of potential looping effects and nonlinear causation as the activity cascades through it. And this might not just vary from part of brain to brain, but as a function of even like the dose. So it might be the case that, for instance, like a microdose of psychedelics might be a very different beast from a macrodose. So it's like, so this paper called ALBUS, or Altered Beliefs Under Psychedelics, which tries to describe both strength and relaxed beliefs. I try to describe an account of how, like, as you increase the dose of psychedelics, you might get these qualitatively different effects. So like a microdoser might be going for something more like flow in terms of like optimal engagement with the world. And that might be, on some levels, there might be a relaxed belief story in that like your self process might get relaxed a bit. But in terms of like the processes by which you have phenomenal binding, that might actually be stronger. But then if you really start cranking the dose, then you might get more, REBUS type effects or relaxation coming in. But the idea being that like, some like programmer or artist trying to come into creativity and be like engaged in a specific task, or might be having different things happening than someone who's on like a heroic dose of mushrooms, for instance. Like that,
Right.
that's not necessarily the same account. But so,
Cool.
yes.
No, that was, I thought that was really well explained, and I'm glad we got through some complex theoretical background on free energy principle, because I think it sets up that psychedelics conversation so well. That's such an interesting idea. So the boundary constraints that we've placed on our life, otherwise known as our prior beliefs, kind of dissolve. And I'm curious, I thought it was such an interesting point about how, we have weakening of some beliefs, but also strengthening of some beliefs. And it seems like in that ego dissolution, from both personal experience and the literature, what we see is sort of a dissolving of our prior beliefs about society, almost things like the rat race, corporations, money, hierarchy, status. I mean, that's why it's all ego. So it's sort of externally directed. Our beliefs about our role in society, our beliefs about how important getting that raise at work, getting that salary bump, all of that seems to kind of flatten, and we start to question it. But then we have strengthening beliefs about how important our personal relationships are, how important, I don't know, different things like nature. And I'm curious on if that's really been mapped out. Why is it the case that it seems to be a weakening on sort of externalized beliefs and dissolving of the boundary constraints of like the rat race and corporate culture and these societal expectations, but there seems to be that strengthening on a personal level, on relationship with your parents, relationship with your girlfriend, your boyfriend, anything else. That's such an interesting area to explore for me. Has that really been teased apart on why that is, on how that happens?
I mean, so, well, a lot is, I think that's one of the most fascinating questions I say in like psychedelic science, and maybe like all of neuroscience.
Right.
And I think there's a lot that's unknown. Some parts of what could explain this difference in what's relaxed versus strengthened and might have to do with potentially even like the location within not just like the layers of the cortical sheet, but within the cortical hierarchy as a whole of where the 5-HT2A receptors are concentrated. And so they tend to actually be concentrated in deeper portions of the overall brain as generative model, like the deeper, closer to like the cortical hubs, and specifically, you'll have like the posterior midline structures, like around the posterior cingulate, in particular. And these are also some of the strongest sources of alpha power in the brain in terms of like what would allow like your entire sensorium to be bound together coherently. But these locations where you're having both high concentrations around these areas of the 5-HT2A receptors, and you're getting the kinds of sync that would bring your sensorium together. Interestingly, they also get a lot of head direction information. So like there's this old idea of like the Papez circuit in terms of like this core like circuit for emotional memory that was like mapped out based on like where epileptiform discharges were coming. But if you look at like this part of the area of the brain where you see like a downregulation with psychedelics and of the alpha power group there, it's basically receiving through the mammillary bodies. You're getting stretch receptor information from the neck, and via the anterior thalamic relay, you're getting the vestibular apparatus. You're getting like yaw, pitch, and roll. And so like a lot of what would actually give you like a coherent egocentric perspective is concentrated in these areas that are more likely, it seems to be disrupted. And also not just classic psychedelics, but ketamine also. You'll see like the dissociation, you'll see like disruption of this posterior alpha rhythm. And I'd say this account of REBUS actually is more straightforwardly applies to ketamine than it does classic psychedelics. Because instead of even thinking about like something like paradoxical excitation-induced disinhibition, ketamine, it inhibits the NMDA receptors, which would be basically part of what would give you at the top level cortical sheet. Basically, would let you getting all these crisscrossing axons and basically letting you register the mutual information from like broad swaths of the area. You're directly disrupting the areas, the parts of the brain that would be able to integrate information from multiple regions and bring together. And also you're exciting actually the AMP receptors level 2, 3, they're picking up the prediction. So this idea of like so self versus world. I don't know how far we want to go with this, but some of what even lets you egocentric.
We're there, Adam. We're already there. Let's go as far. We're there already. Let's go.
So the part of what would help you to establish yourself as an I or a point of view in the world, you end up getting basically more like entropy injected there, and that could be part of what lets you let go of like self-other distinction.
Explain that a little bit more. The entropy injection. What does that mean?
So these areas, either their ability to have coherent activity,
right.
Being reduced, and so they're being more chaotic or atypical patterns of firing, less powerfully coherent or synchronous.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so no one. Yeah, so but this idea of like the default mode network, and where this is entailing a kind of part of what the default thing you're predicting is your self-world relation, and also your self-world relation conditioned on episodic memory. And so like the default mode is Demis Hassabis called like the brain's construction machinery, or like how you're like imagining just these different scenarios, like with the work with Schachter. But this idea of like what you're constantly doing is like imagining yourself based as what you're in the past, how you're going to be in the future, and that this ability to imagine your self-world relation, that the default mode, losing its default mode of operation, being part of what would be to let go of self, or the primary thing you're doing is selfing. You're imagining yourself, what you got to do as you move through the world, all your plans and what happened in the past, what you think might happen in the future. And so the account from psychedelics that tries to get at that, I think, which tends to center on the default mode networks, changing its default mode of operation.
Yes. Very cool. Very, very cool. I think this whole conversation is so fascinating. Do you think that you can predict? Sorry, go ahead.
There's one paper I think you'll love. It was one special issue that Mike Levin did. It's called Selfos, and it actually takes the default mode network account and it tries to generalize it into the Hydra and across basically all life. And it claims that basically you have a generalization of the default mode in terms of slow oscillations that are taking in holistic information from the organism, and that this is not just like something that mammalian brains do, but every single life form does, going back to an individual cell. Right, so I'll send you this paper. I think you'll love it.
Yeah, please. Sounds like the kind of insanity that a Michael Levin paper would imply. That sounds amazing. Yeah. I'm really curious. Is the reason that there's so much variance in, the type of people that psychedelics really seem to help in therapy or have negative reactions with, would that be related to the density and distribution of 5-HT2A receptors in the brain, like where they are in the columns? I wonder, can you make any predictions about the effects that psychedelics could have in terms of relaxing or strengthening different priors based on receptor density and distribution? Do you know if that's been fleshed out at all in the research?
it would be hard to imagine that not being the case, but
Yeah.
I think it's been very not really fleshed out at all, I'd say. The like for and you could see like potentially even um different people as like an inter-individual difference variable that might be very important for personality and like explaining cognition be actually naturally tuned towards different degrees of like psychedelic like type cognition, and that, like there might be people
Right.
who might be like more readily like access flow could be part of it even.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe like more like shamanic type personalities, and if you take it too far it could even be potentially like a diathesis for something like schizophrenia even. um, and potentially even part of why these genes persist in the population, and that like in other forms they could be associated with more creative cognition. And so there are almost certainly differences of the kinds you're describing, but I don't think we've been able to use that predictively for anything like, for instance, titrating
Right.
psychedelic psychotherapy, or being
Right.
able to. I don't think we've ever done the work to predictively do that, to explain different responses. Although I'm sure what you're saying has to be correct.
Right. That's what I was going to say. Could this be part of a pre-screening for psychedelic therapy, where you go in, you get your brain scanned, you get your serotonin receptor distribution mapped, and then we can titrate dose based on that, or maybe we can even specify the type of psychedelic. I don't even know, are there ways to induce the synthesis of new serotonin receptors in particular areas where they don't have it, and then that would make it more effective? There's loads of sort of pre-screening therapeutical protocols you could happen there that might increase the efficacy of like a psychedelic trial.
Mm. It definitely seems that way. And so maybe you would do like a pet study, and then you would like you would look for like radioactive um, uh, binding of like things to like the 5-HT2A receptor, and see like who's got what concentration, and then use that as a predictor variable. That could I don't think anyone's attempted that. I don't know what the predictive utility would be, but it could be substantial. An interesting thing about the receptors, to like whether they change, um, is uh, I've seen some evidence that it's like usually like when you hammer a receptor system, it downregulates to try to like maintain things within a certain bounds. You're usually getting like a negative feedback, but
Right.
I've seen some evidence that you'll actually get positive feedback, where like more so some psychedelic stimulation can actually result in like increased expression of those
Interesting.
receptors.
That's very
Yeah.
interesting. I've never heard that before. I wonder
So
how interesting. Could that have something to do with, there's been, I believe there's data on, people who do psychedelics. I think it's a year later, or it's 2 years later, they're like a standard deviation more open to experience, so the really long lasting synaptic changes that manifests itself in personality and how you face new challenges. I wonder, is that related to the increased expression of serotonin receptors across time because of the psychedelics?
is it the serotonin receptors? I mean, they also will tend to like hit mTOR, and so you're just going to get more like synaptogenesis, and so things might get more like promiscuously connected to each other from the 5-HT2A receptor stimulation also. So is it that like you're getting it's a receptor level story? Is it a connectivity story? Is it both? But is it yeah, potentially though, this is very speculative, but like to the degree you do get like certain forms of like positive feedback or enduring change, you can almost think of it as like adjusting like your life histories in terms of like what you need going forward. Like so, the so in general, serotonin will be released in response to like some like stressful like challenging situations. And so like Robin Card Harris has a really good paper, like A Tale of Two Receptors, he did with David Nutt. I think person does a
Spoken
drink
to
actually.
twice. Yeah.
And so they talk about like how there's like you have like when you first get the serotonin elevating, you'll get like the 5-1A receptors. It's called like passive coping, in terms of you'll enter a state of sort of like patient quiescence. But then if like you keep cranking it, the organism will switch to like active coping, and this will be taking like more like heroic actions to like save its life. And so there's another paper for it who was Harry Brewer, a collaborative Robbins also called pivotal mental states. But basically this idea of like uh, when something extreme happens, you actually want to be put into like a highly plastic state, and you want to change fundamentally like who you are if you were pushed to such a limit. That like if you're pushed to a limit experience, something very notable happened, and you probably should not be the same person exactly afterwards that happened.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading in one of the big papers published last year, which really well demonstrated this desynchronization of neural populations that we've been talking about. That the number one factor that was correlated with basically the alleviation of depressive symptoms was like a mystical experience. Like they had loads of like tick boxes of things people might experience during a psychedelic experience, and the number one that was correlated with alleviation of depressive symptoms was mystical experience. So that might be somewhat what you're talking about, just something that's just so stunning to you that it really takes you back. And I think it's no wonder that's going to really change you on a fundamental level if it's that arousing in the moment. What kind of psychedelic research really interests you at the moment? What's being done? What are the really big questions? What experiments are just like insanely interesting, and the next couple of years we should be able to get some really cool results?
So I say actually the thing that most interests me is less brain based.
Okay.
And I'm most interested at the moment is interested in the extent to which compassion could mediate positive outcomes with psychedelics, and whether helping people to access compassion could be a beneficial thing to do in psychedelic psychotherapy.
Interesting.
So, like usually, the protocol, like so I did a research fellowship at Hopkins, and like the Hopkins protocol is like you blast the person to the moon with a heroic dose, and it's more like a self-directed thing, and just from that like high arousal, relaxed self state, and then accessing the mystic experience, that seems to be sufficient for creating like life change in a lot of people. And people report this as something, the top 5 most meaningful things that ever happened to them, and for a lot of people, it changes their life around. One of the things I'm wondering though is whether in addition to the mystic state, or even maybe the mystic state connects to like this part of what even mediates the mystic state, is something like self-compassion and compassion for others as being like one of the things you particularly want to change to have like a better life. But so and that's I guess what part would interest me the most. But I guess the other thing would be they're hard studies to do, but Chris Timmerman is doing some very interesting work on this of like some of the intense psychedelics that really alter the self, like 5-MeO-DMT. Like what's going on there in terms of this would connect to some of Metzinger's work with like minimal conscious states, and so using so you can use like advanced like these jhana practitioners who go really deep into meditation, and they can go so deep that they actually like strip down their consciousness to like a basic like luminosity, a basic awareness, and then like eventually even like you get the phenomenology or no phenomenology of coma, where like you can have like cessation experiences where things black out. So DMT, there seems 5-MeO-DMT, there seems to be a convergence there in terms of also like getting to a very stripped down minimal form of consciousness. And so using psychedelics as a probe on what might be the physical and computational substrates of even phenomenal consciousness, there could be fruitful avenues to go there. And then I guess the other thing I would personally be interested in would be for someone to like dig more into this idea that there might be dose-dependent effects, and that psychedelics might be doing the same thing the whole way through. In general, like if you look at like animal studies, you'll use this like head twitch paradigm, and instead of like focusing so much on like a dose response curve, you'll dose the animal to where it starts tweaking, and that tends to be like a very high dose, and then you'll study what happens there versus not. And so the idea that like when you're getting strengthened and relaxed beliefs based on different levels of stimulation, whether like there is a very different story to be said for like microdosing versus like macrodosing? Like I'd be curious to for people to dig into the potential diversity of psychedelic experiences.
For sure. For sure. I mean, definitely more dose relationship studies have to be done. I mean, it's such an obvious one, but important that there's no drug in the world where dose doesn't impact the response, right? And sometimes you can get very different response. You can get very different pharmacology in the receptor interactions, and it just has to be done. DMT is a really
Oh,
sorry.
just one quick thing is part of what I'm thinking in terms of the dose response is that whether microdosing slash threshold dosing might actually be closer to like the native normative range of the 5-HT2A system as would be encountered ecologically, and where maybe the bulk of the selection happened evolutionarily. So like the 5-HT2A receptor first came online around the Cambrian explosion with like the advent of jawed fishes. And so I've actually been wondering whether like it's specifically overclocking the predictions of the organism for the sake of predator-prey arms races. So either like allow you to more effectively like swim down your prey or to avoid becoming prey. But there is, and I guess I've also been wondering in terms of like a more rebus type story, whether that happens, so it could just be a fluke, but whether there was selection for that regime, and whether that actually might have happened in the context of orgasm and birthing. Potentially near-death experiences also, but and potentially mediated by something like endogenous DMT. So is part of the reason that we can trip that actually you wanted organisms to have these like high arousal, self-altered experiences in the context of either bonding to a mate or bonding to offspring, or not bonding to the void. It could be all of them. I don't know which, but the one question I have about the near-death experience story is I wonder, like, if you got there, did you void the warranty? Like, how often did you get to a near-death experience and survive in nature? But like, in terms of we definitely though had to, especially for big-brained, vulnerable offspring, having creature like us, we definitely bonded to each other. So there was sex at some point, and there was a birthing, and the mother had to bond to the offspring to get for at least a little bit. Otherwise, wouldn't have worked. So the different doses, I'm wondering to what degree there's like different evolutionary stories here, where like the microdose is closer to this like original functioning of the specs of the 5-HT2A system for overclocking or turbocharging the predictions of the organism for enhanced agentic behavior. But then you're having like a more like rebus-like thing that happens and that came along at some point in the evolution of mammals.
Fascinating. You have a broad range of interests, my friend. The stuff going on inside your brain is absolutely crazy. Have you ever tried DMT yourself?
DMT, but not 5-MeO. I'm yet to encounter the toad.
Okay. And what was that experience like?
It varies. Interesting thing about DMT is it's very short acting. It's only like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And so you have less likelihood of receptor downregulation. So you could do it. Wouldn't recommend it. You could do it fairly frequently though. And you, when I was doing it, I was like trying to try out different psychedelic regimes. Like, okay, so I'm gonna try like a little bit versus being like, is it actually different? So and it's also, I say, a very different animal. So it's like there's like a small amount is like someone who's like using like a vape pen or something. Not that I'm recommending this, but like that might be more like, you're like dipping into flow or just like creative cognition. But then you go past a certain amount and you get transported to another world. And that world contains agentic things that are not you. and so these DMT entities, they can be quite wild, and they the gods are not always merciful of the DMT world. Some people like Joe Rogan, for instance, like he'll report, it's like a playground. It's awesome. For me, it's like, geez, wow. Like these guys. So that was my experience, but I think it varies a lot between people in terms of what they encounter. But what's commonly reported when people go to this other world is they'll encounter entities. Terrence McKenna called them machine elves.
Yes.
So there seems to be like a symmetrification of your experience and like kind of like geometric, like complexification and clarity, and then agents come.
Yeah. hold on. I need you to explain what those two sentences mean. The symmetrification of your experience, and then geometry. Explain what those sentences mean. I have absolutely
So
no
kind
idea
of
what that sentence
like an
means.
Alex Gray painting would be like the fractal. You might get
Right.
fractal imagery coming, but like for instance, like uh, uh circles seem more circular. It's it's like uh, like a lot of people report actually that the DMT world feels more real than the real world. And for people who like don't have like stable ontologies, it'll actually sometimes cause them to actually change their belief about the nature of the world. And some people will say like there's this other dimension that's more real. I think the DMT world is psychologically real. I don't, but but then so the agents is then within this world there will be beings, and I don't know if this works, whether we're talking about relaxed or strengthened beliefs, but one of the things like in general you should predict if like the generative models of your brain, what they should generate would be uh, agentic phenomena in beings, because that's our primary niche and part of as social animals. It's a large bulk of what we're constantly thinking about and encountering. But and so then these beings will take on different characteristics that seem to be somewhat archetypal and common across people. Like they're oftentimes reported as being mischievous, the machine elves. But for some people, they might be fun tricksters. For some people, they might be less fun tricksters.
Sorry, I think my
I would not encourage people to go like nuts on like experimenting with DMT.
right.
It's something one could try in different combinations, but it's a very intense substance, and for some people, it is destabilizing.
Yeah, an important disclaimer to add. It's one psychedelic that I haven't tried. I mean, there's a few I haven't tried, but I've tried LSD and psilocybin multiple times. DMT I haven't, and I'm kind of curious about it. I'm slightly cautious about it, but I'm really interested in like what is it doing differently where people have this experience with these other communicating with these other agents. Why does that not happen? Or it does happen probably sometimes with LSD and psilocybin, but you definitely hear of it more in relation to DMT, as you're saying. Do we know what specifically that is? What DMT is doing differently? Do we know why it doesn't happen as much with other psychedelic substances?
It might primarily be just its potency as 5-HT2A, or there's people have it's not just all the 2A. So oftentimes the 2C could be even more important, but it might be a more potent serotonergic mimic
Okay.
than and so like for uh, so you will get like entities, you can get them with like psilocybin and LSD, but that will be like the heroic or the god doses where people tend to talk about that.
Right.
But
And do we know what that is? Is there a neural correlate of DMT mechanical mischievous agents? Is there like a neural signature of that?
so so Chris Timmerman has done DMT studies where he's actually showing some evidence that like the predictive usual effects are changed of like predictions going down and prediction errors going up, that actually these traveling waves of predictions going down are reduced with DMT. But I don't think a manipulation has been done of like titrating it to elves versus non, or like entities versus non-entities, and then zooming in on those neural correlates. So you might
Right.
expect like some areas like temporal parietal junction, maybe medial prefrontal cortex, like seeing some like differences in functional connectivity there or something like that. But I don't think anyone has specifically done the entity manipulation and looked for those neural correlates. They're working towards that, I think, in terms of they've been working on infusion protocols for DMT, like collaboration between Robin and Chris Timmerman. And so that data might be in the pipeline potentially, actually, but it's not been
Fascinating.
published yet. So
When we figure out the neural correlates of mechanical DMT elves, we need to get on a round two to discuss that, because this is just it's
yes.
so interesting to me. Do you think there's any truth to the idea that psychedelics are revealing some true nature of reality? Are we seeing things more clearly with psychedelics, or is it all just hallucinations the whole way down?
I'd say there is like a truth to the mystic experience, and that your interview, with Jill Bolte Taylor, like that during that conversation, like there is something I'd say the most fundamental truths do seem to be more clear in terms of uh, the miraculousness of existence, or there is a perspective from which we're all part of it together, and like
Yeah.
our separation, their perspectives from which we're less separate. The same time, the left hemisphere mode that she talks about, like that's also a useful one, and that's like, I wouldn't say it's untrue, and that like the separate story, the you is a separate self, and like skin encapsulated ego doing your thing, like that's pretty important for getting along in the world. Like I don't know if like even if you can access the ecstasy of the right hemisphere, she calls it, or by whatever means, the sort of oneness, ecstatic state, it doesn't seem like you can live from there. So it seems like there's a truth of like, we're all part of this one miraculous existence, and we're not completely separate from each other, and we're all intensely interdependent and very fundamentally similar, and like share spirit in so many ways. But there's also like the truth of like, we're all doing our thing, and we got to do our thing like also separately. And so, so I think some fundamental truths are revealed, and by the mystic experience. And for some people, they're life-saving, like that sense of like gratitude and connectedness. And for some people, it's destabilizing.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. That connectedness, that feeling of we're not so different from each other. Is there any element there that you think is revealing some form of universal consciousness? Are we all combined in some sort of complicated web, some quantum field that we don't understand, and psychedelics is peering down deep into those deeper layers of objective reality, and it is exposing some universal consciousness? Or is that just garbage? Like, does that make no sense at all?
I wouldn't call it garbage.
Interesting.
But whether it's like I guess it depends like how universal is the consciousness. So like this sense of like there's a view of the world that's not self-centered, and that the world as a whole has like harmonies that are bigger than any of us. That seems right. But the idea the psychedelics are stripping away, and then that reality is coming in, well, in a way, yeah, they're stripping away like the self world, like those beliefs that separate self from world. And to the, but I guess it depends. What do we mean by consciousness, and how universal is it?
Yeah, define terms. Make sense. But it's not just, you think there's there may be something is to it. There's something there. It's not just people being stoned out of their mind and being high out of their mind and getting a sense of connectedness, that there might be something deeper there, and something more real. And it does, of course, depend on how you define consciousness, but it's not as woo-woo as it might seem on initial inspection.
No, I mean, it's the view of like the way ourselves, in terms of like the way we are reflected in each other, the way we contain each other, we're continuous with each other, like we're touched like deeply, and we're defined by like the web of relations we're in, and we're all participating in these things that are bigger than any of us. And so I think there's a sense in which like the most meaningful things about us are bigger than us and are not particular to us. And so like, and if basically relaxing your assumptions of your usual separation help you to tune into this, I think, fundamental truth of our connectedness. That doesn't seem like nonsense to me. That seems like that seems like a deeply important insight.
Really well said. Very, very well said. I think I couldn't have said it better myself, and maybe a good place to end. Very well said, Adam. This has been so much fun. This conversation went down rabbit holes and directions that I didn't necessarily expect. You clearly have such a wide breadth of knowledge, and you're clearly integrating different fields, different areas of consciousness, to anatomy, to biology, to intelligence, to AI, psychedelics. So many interesting fields merging together. Insane eclectic mix of interests, and I think maybe we'll need a round 2 to dive into them further. But Adam, this has been an immense amount of fun. I hope it didn't get too complex for people. Maybe in the middle around free energy principle, we had to kind of get through the weeds of some stuff that you just can't simplify that much. But I think it was worth going on that trek because we got to a really interesting place with psychedelics, I think, and a really meaningful conversation around consciousness and everything else. I really, really enjoyed it, Adam. Thank you so much for your time. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I've been just loving these conversations you've been having, and
thank you, man.
I'll keep tuning in, and it's been so good to talk to you.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you. If you made it this far, then you must at least partially be interested in brain science. And who can blame you? It is the most interesting topic in the world. Twice per week, I talk to the most amazing neuroscientists in the entire world. So if you're interested, then subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below who you'd like me to speak to next. And thank you so much for your ongoing support.